you know, the theme of this blog that I so appreciate is you talk about what stretches our hearts and shapes our desires. And you talk about how Teilhard brings in these two dimensions of the withinness and the withoutness that you talk about as radial energy and tangential energy and consciousness and love. And so I thought we would maybe just begin by talking about this word consciousness that we keep throwing around and talking about so much. Maybe just to start from a scientific lens.
Yeah.
What do we mean by that word consciousness, and how would you define consciousness?
Right. Yeah. I think in my new book, I do a lot. I begin with quantum physics and quantum consciousness. And I think part of the problem with consciousness is that we're approaching it from our own human experience of awareness. And I think this is just sort of the last train. This is the last train car on consciousness. I think we're beginning at the wrong place, in other words, to talk about consciousness. I think, when we take quantum physics as our sort of our guide here, we're saying that there is no matter, there's no determination of matter apart from consciousness. So what we are saying, therefore, is consciousness is fundamental to matter, which has led, scientists to just begin to speculate that since matter is energy, and since the Big Bang begins with energy, that consciousness is present from the beginning, which means consciousness is not about awareness per se, although it comes into the human as that form. But I think consciousness is about informational flow. It's really about the energy between things, or as fields, we might say, are overlapping. We might say waves of fields are overlapping. You have an informational exchange. And that, I think, is the rudiments of consciousness, which over time, as it begins to complexify, in other words, as the fields become more complex in their relatedness, consciousness takes on a more complex dimension, ultimately in this notion of awareness, or this kind of building up of an inner-outer relationship. Now, there are a lot of people, not a lot, there are people who have also kind of suggested that consciousness is light. So light and consciousness are the same thing. So when we say we're enlightened, it means we have a type of consciousness that's more unified. So just as we're light, you can see things, so consciousness, you can see things. So, which is kind of interesting because light is energy, right? Light is photons. So I think we can say that consciousness is that light energy that is constantly flowing throughout nature and comes to a complex level in the human that expresses itself in a awareness of otherness, ultimately. Now, so just to continue, so Teilhard sees that consciousness and love are really not two separate things. They're two forms of the same energy. So it makes sense that if there's informational flow between things, that flow of information then becomes a force of attraction, so that when I'm more aware of something, I'm, as I'm aware of it, I'm either attracted to it or perhaps repelled by it, I'm not sure. But what he saw is that, in nature, since nature is very simple, that the rise of consciousness is, in a sense, the rise of love. So this withinness and withoutness, which is really wholeness, right? So there's no, withinness and withoutness is sort of a, what we call a heuristic or a model to describe, universal wholeness. But I think what we're saying is we've been living partial lives, we're partial wholes, because we're only tending to one or the other, but we never see these as two forms of the same energy.
Yeah. So, okay. So that was a lot. Let me recap. You're just explaining the whole theory of consciousness. It almost seems, and I'm glad that you started with this, because we do tend to associate consciousness with a sense of intelligence or self-reflective capacities. And what you're saying is, from a scientific lens, what we're discovering at the quantum level is this idea of consciousness, almost like a matrix, like the very matrix of reality, this energetic exchange that is sort of pervading everything. It's like in all things is how everything works.
Right.
And that as that informational exchange continues and becomes more complexified, as it becomes a bigger and bigger unit or a more complex unit, then we get the things that we more typically associate with consciousness, with the self-reflection and intelligence, observation. And then what's fascinating then is to weave in this other piece that you do in your blog with Teilhard's observations, that we could think about this all as love. So not love in our sentimental views of love, but love as that energy force that is creating new forms of life at all times and building on itself. That's it.
So maybe, and one more thing maybe to add, which I go through a lot in my book, is that consciousness, the rise in consciousness is in a sense the overcoming of any space. Consciousness and unity go together. So, which is interesting. So I think in some ways there's a relationship between consciousness and space. Maybe that's what I want to say. And the rise in consciousness overcomes any spatial differences insofar as consciousness is, in a sense, the inner side of love, and love unifies. So, and I think that kind of unification of love is the expansion of the universe. I mean, I think that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about a type of energy that is becoming more and more expansive and whole in a certain way. So to put this another way, when we're sort of half conscious or when we're cut off from love, we also experience the spatial separations, or what we call isolation. So there's a deep connectivity between these realities.
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, so let's say, so if consciousness is this pervasive matrix in which all these things are happening, and love is that same thing, when we cut ourselves off, or we believe that we're isolated, are we indeed isolating ourselves, or is it an illusion?
That's a good question. I think we're isolating ourselves. In other words, I think we have the capacity, because our consciousness is such, and the expression of that consciousness in terms of love, we have the capacity for unity. But when we have sort of our brains are distracted or detached from the outer world, then we are in a sense isolating ourselves, and therefore we create the spatial separations.
So then it's like a relational field, right? So like this matrix is actually responsive, you're saying, to how we interact with it. In other words, when I isolate myself, there is an action.
Well, we're part of it, right? So we're part of this matrix. Yeah, so we don't much interact with it, but we're part of it in our task. Einstein said this, he had that wonderful quote, that our task is to free ourselves from this prison, a sense of partial consciousness, and awaken to the whole of which we're part of. So that's what science is telling us. We're part of this whole.
Right.
So we have complexified to the point where we can choose, in a sense, or we can distract ourselves from the whole and live kind of partial reality of consciousness.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think when you say that it's we distract ourselves, or we delude ourselves into thinking that we are separate, rather than that makes sense.
So there's two things. What David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness, right? We can tell you what consciousness is, but we can't tell you how consciousness is, consciousness. And then what's even more mysterious is how we humans have self-reflective consciousness. Although more studies are coming out that even there are non-human forms of other species that seem to have some more primitive level. My cats have definitely a sense of consciousness.
Oh, I have no doubt. They just get it from osmosis from you, but yeah.
So it's really interesting. There's like a feedback loop, consciousness complexifies, and then somehow an I, this ego emerges in a self-reflective way. But even more interesting than the hard problem of consciousness is the hard problem of matter.
Mm.
Like, you cannot get rid of consciousness.
Mm.
How hard you try, it's virtually impossible. And so they're saying that consciousness may not be, the problem per se. Matter is really the key. Like, we think we know what matter is.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're saying is that matter itself may be conscious, part and parcel of consciousness. So consciousness is the stuff of all stuff, maybe put it this way. It's the ground of all ground. We get rid of the word being and just put consciousness in there.
I like that. But yeah, because that gets down to how we tend to separate reality out. We parse it out into, innate matter. And then there's intelligence and consciousness over here. And what you're saying is that this matrix is consciousness. Consciousness is the matrix of matter and everything else, which is so mystical. This is what the mystics have been saying all along.
Well, exactly. And think of, just back up a step. I mean, by identifying, thinking that we knew what matter was, and then saying how matter is distinguished between races and between languages and between cultures and between religions. We have constructed a world that's artificial in one sense. It's not true to what we now know about nature. And we have cut ourselves off from one another and from nature itself. And so the undoing, the unmasking, and the unmaking of this world is really our own doing. And I think one thing we need to do is to wake up to what science is telling us about nature, and about consciousness at the heart of reality. And the second thing is, mysticism is really coming back into the heart of matter in a way that I think makes a lot of scientists very nervous. Because, this is just like a no-no. You can't have like the hidden, ineffable something at the heart of matter. They're pretty sure they're going to figure it out eventually. That's the whole paradox. You can't figure it out because it's you who are figuring it out. You can't get out of the subjective realm here. So what we are finding is there's no true objectivity without subjectivity. We can't dissociate ourselves from what the real is. So it does bring back, I think science needs to come up with a different method for some, certainly on these levels, other than the scientific method, and the mystical path maybe that's why some scientists are now being drawn more and more along the path of mysticism, because they're realizing there's an ineffability to matter. And the more we try to measure matter or say what matter is, the more it's elusive. Matter like slips out from under the grasp, of the scientific measured device, and says, nope, we're not that. And so I think it does call for a new humility and a vulnerability in the face of what reality is.
Is this what drew you, to the topic of this book that you've written? I think for me, when I first, and I'm not even a scientist, so I don't have that, but when I first encountered quantum physics, there was so much of it that challenged the normal boundaries of how I was taught that science operates, the rules, how things work, that I found myself really attracted to it for the same reasons that I was attracted to mysticism, in the sense that there's this, that ineffable, ungraspable somethingness that seems to be at the heart of all reality. And both these avenues seem to be describing it in different ways, but it's the fact that they're describing it that is so exciting.
Yes, right. So, I think we're saying, at the fundamental levels of life, which is where quantum physics really is operating, that matter, what we call reality, is very paradoxical, if, like as Niels Bohr said, if you think you understand things, you don't have a clue of what you're talking about, because there, and that, so what we call matter or material or reality is really just, we live in a world of fluid potentialities. And I guess that is the hope here. In other words, there is nothing carved in stone. There is no ontological substance that divides us. we can't say that one is better than the other. We are living in a world that's being created. Space is being created. The real is being created in a sense, and consciousness is the creator of what the real is. That's the whole thing. So we need a radical shift in. What this is calling for is a radical shift in philosophy, for one thing. In other words, what undergirds everything is not what we think it, certainly what Aristotle thought, or Thomas Aquinas, and God bless them, may they rest in peace. But it's a very different world, and scientists are. A lot of scientists are still grappling with these new discoveries. We have someone just writing a book in the Catholicity series on quantum Catholicity. In other words, using quantum biology to talk about wholeness in nature. Now, quantum biology is a whole new field. So what we thought we knew what a cell was, now we're saying, well, maybe that's a higher level, but on the lower levels, there's some other things going on here that escape the eye. So it is a matter of, first of all, you have to be there. That's what the world of conscious reality tells us. You can't be in, your body can't be in one place and your mind in another. The mind is what's determining what the real, is. So it does matter where our minds are. And by mind, I don't mean the brain. I think the brain is the synthesizing, it's the machinery that makes mind possible. And I take mind as the synthesizing activity of the flows of information that's consciousness. So I think consciousness, mind, and brain as interrelated, but not the same. So, when we talk about cutting off our mind, we're really talking about sort of brain operations being minimized or diminished, which diminishes the field activity of the mind, which means that our consciousness becomes diminished, in those areas as well. So 3 interrelated areas. And I look today at the world, why talk about all this stuff? Because, someone said to me, well, here are real problems, how do we solve them? And this, we want to solve the problems of politics and economics and history and all this kind of stuff, but we're not doing well. That's, one of the problems is we're not doing well solving these problems. Social justice has been going on now for, a long time, like 40, 50 years, longer than that, for a long time. But, for all the dedicated people that are involved in social justice, our world is not getting better. It's actually seems to be getting worse. Global climate warming is getting warmer. The poor are getting poorer. And we have a political regime that's, scary. So what's wrong with this picture? There's something wrong on the outer layer. That's what we're saying.
Yeah, so it's almost like what you're saying is that, how when you go to a doctor and you say, well, I have this symptom. And the doctor says, well, great, let me treat the symptom. But not really considering what's causing the symptom itself. So what you're saying is that we need a shift in how we think before we can really tackle the problems of
that. And that's exactly what Beatrice Brutto said. She said, we need a shift first within ourselves, an interior shift before any talk of economic, political, social change. And I think she was right on target, and somehow we think these things are, first of all, we treat them separately because we have no sense of a withinness and a withoutness, right? For ours, and, this goes back to your original question, our sense has only been the withoutness. Here it is, here's the world and it's not doing well. We need to do something. And what Teilhard and Brutto said is, you need to do something. And that is find yourself, what's your interior life, your interior milieu, because your interiority is your exteriority. That's what they're saying. There's no exteriority without interiority. So another way to say this is the mess of the world is the mess of our interior lives. It's a seamless flow. You cannot separate them, which we have. So many people don't even know about an interior life. They're like, I have an interior life. What's that?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, our whole structure, our society is built around the exterior. So for many of us,
Absolutely.
And then on top of that, I think we tend to downplay the importance of the interior, as you say. We treat it as not actionable, like that this doesn't actually produce results in the world, and so we view this topic of spirituality or mysticism as somewhat navel gazing, or that you're just interested in your own Zen or whatever, but you're not actually taking care of the real problems of the world.
Right.
What you're saying, it flies in the face of all of that and says, no. Somehow what our interior minds are creating are these problems in the world.
Exactly.
That they're deeply connected and related. Even from what you're discovering at a scientific level, the withinness and withoutness of things can't be thought of as separate anymore.
No, it's one continuous flow. And that's what the mystics tell us, right? As it's outer world within. The outer world flows within me, and what within me flows to the outer world. So that the tree, this is Maria Rainer Rilke says, the tree that grows outside grows in me.
Mm-hmm. Which is interesting too, because that's the experience, when a lot of people, especially I'm thinking of my friends, when a lot of my friends have gone and experienced an activity of service or social justice initiative, what happens in those moments is they encounter an awakening of their interior lives. Mm-hmm. And that's why it becomes so powerful for them.
Yeah.
So it's that there's something that's happening that is awakening the withinness in that external act.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear, actually. And maybe a way forward is when we are engaged in social justice. The social justice is, first we have to recognize what's the violence within me. What's the injustice within me? What's the lack of peace within me? Mm-hmm. What's the lack of poverty within me? Mm-hmm. In other words, we need to come to, I think, a truthfulness about ourselves, and then come to peace. Come to root out. You might say this goes back to the ancients. The rooting out. If you go to Evagrius Ponticus, all the stuff that prevents us from being unified in our consciousness of the whole. Mm. And then I think, I've often wondered that if we took a more mystical approach to social justice, would we, how might that look? What might that look like on a more operative level of daily life? So that we're not because actually we're winding up in the same predicament that causes the problems to begin with. Mm. It's like an alternate agenda. Here it is. Companies are charging for water. Okay, we're going to protest against charging for water. So it's like, we're just flipping the thing, the power and the authority issues. But what if we took just a whole new, a mystical, an interior approach to this, to the questions of social justice? I don't know. It's something to think about. I mean, it's something that I'm beginning to think about more, quite honestly, because I do see, which this book is about, is that consciousness, love, and space go together. And if we could get that, within us, that the first thing we need to do is to constantly, in a sense, monitor where our conscious minds are. What is occupying us at any moment of time, and then just to be conscious of this, of how we relate to others. How we go forth into others, conscious of the distance between us and what creates that distance.
So let's talk about that. I mean, that's like getting down into the practical, right? So we know that we're meant to awaken to this new mind that can perceive that sense of unity and wholeness. What are the things that get in the way? And then how do we practically work with that? What are the disciplines? Because you mentioned this in your blog too, about that this mystical path requires discipline. It's not easy. It's steep, and it goes against our nature in a way because it takes work. And so, what have you found in your own life to be the helpful practices that allow you to sense from the whole, like you talk about?
Yeah. So let me just begin by saying, in the book I talk a little bit about Henri Bergson's notion of creative evolution. Now, Bergson did not accept Darwinian evolution in the sense that he felt that Darwin didn't account for novelty in nature, or what we might call today emergence. Now, there probably are a lot more scientific explanations beyond Bergson, but I thought his insight was interesting, that there has to be something at the heart of nature that challenges nature. Nature is open to becoming something new, but and truthfully, if you look at our lives, we usually tend to resist newness.
Oh yeah.
We don't like to do new things too quickly, right? We do have to get pushed, or something has to really challenge us, and that's where I think Teilhard picks up the Omega principle idea and says, yeah, there is something at the heart of nature that keeps pulling it, onward towards something whole. But I think what are the obstacles or the resistance pieces? One, if you want to look just broadly, I think our society is built up on Newtonian principles. And we're very mechanistic in our thinking. It's just the way we have constructed society and our systems. Corporations, the way we run households, the way we run schools, right? Everything has this kind of pyramid of hierarchy. CEO, vice president, local managers, peons. So we're kind of wired, excuse me, to think along these lines of hierarchy. And it's hard to get around that. It's hard for us to think that if I get on a bus with an elderly Black lady and a Muslim man and, a Buddhist Zen master, that we're all interrelated, that we are actually sharing one reality, one core reality together.
Because those realities are so different, right? Because our experiences are different, yeah.
And so, what the problem is, the way we've constructed the world, is we are really living in multiverses together. I mean, we have not one universe, we have many universes going on. And I think there's a lot of universes bumping into one another. And we're saying my universe is not your universe. And then one of the other major obstacles is the church. I mean, here I can speak from the Catholic Church, which is so divided today, so polarized between those who think Pope Francis is wonderful and that he's really finally getting the church into the modern age, and a whole slew of people who think he's the Antichrist, that he's actually bringing the church downward quickly. And so these ideas are based on concepts of philosophy, what we think, and theology. What is church, what is God, how we think about God. So if we keep thinking in old Greek metaphysical terms, we're going to be, in a sense, in an old church that's based on Greek metaphysics. But if we're thinking in terms of the world as science now discloses it, in terms of what we now know about consciousness and matter, we'll be with Pope Francis and put 2 feet on the ground. So we are caught in systems. And this is our great challenge today. I mean, we're just enmeshed in various systems, and we can't get ourselves out of the systems to think of a new system.
Well, and I think too, what's fascinating is that, and I'm realizing this as a student, right? Is I had no idea how much of our quote unquote reality is actually based on these Greek metaphysical principles that you're talking about. And so I think for many of us, we're operating in a system and don't even realize that we're operating in a system. No clue whatsoever that we're operating in a very specific system with specific boundaries and specific ideas that is simply one opinion, somewhat of an antiquated set of opinions that doesn't match up with what we now know about reality. Like you talk about Newtonian mechanistic systems, and that everything kind of has to, that there's always a cause and an effect.
Right.
And what you're saying is that, well, here quantum physics comes along and is blowing all of these systems out of the water. We now know that creativity. Yeah, go ahead.
Right, creativity of even systems. I mean, complex dynamical systems. That systems don't work this kind of simple causal A to B to C.
Yeah.
There's top down, bottom up influences, and that any system is working at any one time with a variety of influences, and then to add, within that, and the substratum is this quantum phenomenon, as because of a lot of what we're calling a system at the heart of it is bubbling fields of energy, that are overlapping. So, right. So we have systems based on substance. That's the one thing, substance ontology. God is being. That's, when we say that, we have a substance view of God as usually a male, an elderly male being. When we use the language of heaven, we have a substance idea that heaven is a place that we're going to go to. Or if we use the language of soul, we have a substance view of soul. Even if we say it's the form, a form within the body, no one has an idea. What's a form within a body? What does that mean? So people think I have something within me called a soul, that's something that's important.
Concrete, right.
Concrete, not a field of activity or related to consciousness. And so the thing is, we like substance because, it's something we can hold on to. It seems to be real. But it's the most illusory thing we can talk about, actually. There is no such thing as substance, really, per se. There's
energy.
Right. But, what we know is that forms can change. I hear Aristotle would agree with this, but energy can be packed into different forms. I mean, you have, a water droplet that can become gas or it can become ice. Or it can just be vapor. So the fluidity of forms is not in our thinking, right? So we like substance. We hold on to it. And we think everything is substantial. This is what the president is. This is what government is. This is what the church is. This is what a human person is. And the fact is, all of this is changing right before our eyes, because we have cut ourselves off consciously. We have become unconscious to what the deeper realities are.
So then, speaking now that we've sort of addressed what the barriers are of that wholeness, what are some steps we can take to begin to move back into that wholeness, that sense of wholeness? How do we consciously move against that temptation to create substance and separation out of everything?
I think maybe in a more general sense, I think we need to create an interior universe. We live in this outer universe, but we don't know our own inner universe. And I think in my book, I actually use a 13th century mystic, Thomas Gallus, who developed this notion that the soul mirrors the cosmos. And so he used the Dionysian hierarchies to talk about the soul, which mirrored the Dionysian hierarchies in the cosmos. So I took that same paradigm, but I applied it to today and say, well, maybe our soul today mirrors the cosmos, which means it's expanding, it's light-filled, it's got consciousness. And so I think we need to, I would say we've done enough discovery now in the outer universe that can last us for a while. Why not discover our inner universe? Be an explorer.
Like that T.S. Eliot line, old men ought to be explorers.
There we are. That's right. You explore your inner universe. And that could be prayer, it could be meditation, it could be silent walks. But I do think silence is important. I think being conscious of inner space is important. In other words, to know when your inner space is clogged up like a drain. To know when you have filled it with all sorts of junk. And to know when to empty it, like files,
I just, exactly. When do you have to empty the trash of your mind?
Yeah, exactly.
But, it's interesting. I was just having a conversation with a friend about, we were talking about experiences in nature and how drawn we are to going on just retreat times in the wilderness and the kinds of things that emerge out of that space, even when you just create like a weekend to say, I'm going to go with a few friends, we're going to have a bonfire, and then we're all going to go off into our own corners and spend 24 hours in solitude in the wilderness. And my friend was saying, you wouldn't believe the conversations that come back from those experiences just by creating a little bit of space for inner experience. And one of the things that strikes me about that is what you said earlier about how well, this makes perfect sense, because we tend to think of nature as just innate, matter. But you're saying, no, this is all full of consciousness. And so, of course, it makes
Absolutely.
sense that when we take the time to go away, that these things happen. Yeah.
Absolutely. Have you read The Hidden Life of Trees, the book, The Hidden Life of Trees?
I have it, but I have The Secret Language of Plants, which I think is an entirely different author. But I'm guessing that there's some very similar premises.
Right. Yeah, the sociability among trees, the consciousness that's flowing among them, the knowing when to bend, so to speak, and to sprout, and it's just amazing. So we haven't given nature enough credit, for one thing. Yeah. And I think, because we have lived with this sense that we're superior, we're distinct, we're our image of God, and nature is just out there someplace, we have really done a disservice to the fact that we are nature, that this nature is what we are. So I think nature is our best teacher, really, for everything, for God, for self, for our future, because nature has the inner-outer flow of life. In other words, it hasn't cut off its withinness from its withoutness like we have.
Yeah.
Artificial withoutness. And that's what we have. We have an artificial withoutness.
Yeah. So that must,
could you imagine if government leaders got together and went to the wilderness for 24 hours for a power summit meeting?
Yeah.
Could you imagine what kind of political decisions might, follow out of that? Mm. So, but the question is, how do we move from where we are? We know this now on a grassroots level. How do we begin to help make systemic structural changes out of this new awareness? I think that's something we need to begin to work towards, right? So we don't want to keep this on an individual level, or what I might call a therapeutic level. For myself.
Yeah.
That it does have to impact everything about us, which means our decision making in the public sphere, how we vote, what we tend to, what we will choose to resist, how we even say hello to one another on the most mundane levels, So I do think we have to move from the mundane to the largesse of a world order.
Yeah, I'm thinking of that. Yeah, nature certainly, is a part of that. But I'm glad you're bringing up that we can't just make this about a privatized sort of feeling good of having my own quote unquote private communion with nature, in which I sense the oneness in all things, but that it actually has to have a bearing. I recently read that awesome article by Beatrice Brutto, Freedom, at the end of the Grand Option, where she talks about moving from domination paradigms into communion paradigms, which seems exactly aligned with what you're saying. And so is one step toward that, I wonder, for us to begin to see how we can converge our efforts. In other words, we have a way of viewing my social justice thing is this. I'm working for this nonprofit. You're working for that nonprofit. How do we begin to bring these things together and converge into more of a collaborative approach to things? Yeah.
Maybe that could be the focus for the Omega Center gathering.
Yeah, a great convergence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it does require, I don't think we're going about things, a lot of very, very good efforts, really. There are a lot of wonderful people, but maybe we do need a different approach. How do we begin to build an inner universe approach to the outer world of social justice? Mm-hmm. That's our question, And and it doesn't mean just praying together or taking time, there's something much deeper here. And I think we have to just take some time now to reflect, how did science get to this understanding? Mm-hmm. And, how does science make these great paradigm shifts, which it did, And there's other things that are needed here. First, we have to trust, trust life. Trust the processes of life. Trust our experience,
Trust each other.
Trust each other. Mm-hmm. Trust the fact that we have the capacity to know, beyond what we already know, that we don't know everything. In fact, we know nothing, actually, if you want to take the mystical approach. All the knowledge that we have is as nothing as to all that awaits us. So I think there are I think the inner universe calls for a whole new set of values and virtues, as well as practices, and But I also think, quite honestly, this is the emergence of the Christ. In other words, from a Christian perspective or a religious perspective, this is what it means to be religious. You know, it be committed to what is forming within us. You know, it doesn't mean just to go off and pray and that God will, you know, I'm preaching to the choir here, you know, that God will save us, but that it's God, ultimately it's God who's seeking to be emerge within us, right? So the wholeness that we seek is that wholeness that finds its ultimate root in divinity. And so I think, you know, if you want to ask what also has prevented us from, you know, from moving forward, it is the tradition of religions, not just Christianity. I think all world religions are just dealing with old cosmologies and old ways, old philosophical ways of thinking about things. So religion needs a major overhaul, you know.
Yeah, so like even the metaphysics of what we have built a lot of our theology on, particularly in the Christian tradition, is only one perspective. I mean, and to realize that within each tradition there is a stream of mystical thought and a mystical heart that has always perceived from oneness. It really does seem that is the call of our time, is to move into that mystical stream and to begin functioning from it. And maybe that explains why so many people are interested and attracted to contemplation, meditation, mysticism.
Yeah. So I do think like our efforts to move forward must be in other words, we must invite all people from all different religions and, you know, into this interior withinness and withoutness, right? Because it's within there's one heart in the heart of the world, right, that we all are a part of. And I think that's what we're saying. I mean, we have to let go of trying to work out doctrinal differences. I mean, like I guess there's a few scholars who want to just parcel out, you know, what God said or what God didn't say. But I think that's just, maybe it'll get you tenure or something, but it's really useless for, you know, moving forward. And I think the operative word here is forward. It's what's up ahead, not what's behind us, right? And I think both Teilhard and Beatrice Butoh understood this. And I love Beatrice's idea. Creativity may be the true act of interior faith. To believe is not something just to, you know, to do.
Hang on to.
To have faith is to be part of the creative process. Because we trust, because we believe, we are, in a sense, willing them to become something new, you know, to move from individualism to personhood, to use her paradigm, you know. So I do think the key to the whole thing, with Bernard of Clairvaux understood in his own way, is freedom, interior freedom. And I think, you know, all that we're saying here is we are partials, we're partial wholes, we're cut off, you know, in our minds. Our consciousness is dimmed most of the time. We're kind of absorbed within ourselves. And funny enough, the self-absorption is actually a lack of withinness, because where the inner universe is alive and active, there's freedom. There's freedom to become something new, you know. So.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's coming to me in what you just said is that the absence of that interior life creates somewhat of a paranoia, a false paradigm that I'm in this alone, I have to do all this myself, I have to prove these things myself, I have to, you know, there's all these I have to's. And the discovery of the withinness, that interconnected whole, is this relaxation into, I am participating in something ancient that is moving, changing, shifting, growing, and I no longer have to. It's I get to participate. So it is. I'm sensing the freedom in what you're saying through the capacity to trust that we're not in this alone and isolated little particles that are sort of random. Yeah.
Right. You know, as St. Augustine said, ever ancient, ever new. And I think, you know, and I think what, you know, this word God, I'm just preparing this course on the Trinity and non-duality. And it's going to be good. It's just really great. But I'm ending the course on Trinitization because I think what we are saying is God, you know, I know Richard has written about this and others, you know, the Godding, the verbing of God, you know, that. it means that God is always on the cusp of the new. When we use that language of God, it means we're always on the cusp of a new future. And we've lost sight of that because of our Greek metaphysics and our metaphysics of the eternal present. You know, that word God has meant here, now, salvation, you know, stability and
certainty.
Certainty, right, all that kind of stuff. So we need to, we just need work on every level. And I think we can begin ourselves in our everyday level of just asking ourselves every morning, what is my interior space like today? What is my inner universe like today? You know, is it just filled up with junk? Does it look like my basement? You know, or is there a freedom to expand? You know, and I think we have to begin each day anew as if we're a new Big Bang, you know, as if each day is a Big Bang, you know, and that bang now is expanding, you know, and space is being created. And as space is being created, love, you know, unifies that space. That's what we're saying. You know, consciousness, in a sense, awakens to what is, and I think that's what the creation of the space is. Love unifies that which is, you know, into something more whole. And I think if we can begin working there, we can begin then to deepen that inner universe flowing into the outer universe. And I think from there we can begin to create. We have to create new systems. I think we can challenge the present ones, but we have to create new ones. I don't think otherwise I think we can be banging our heads against walls. And that could mean revolution, you know, it could mean quiet revolutions of some type. But I think we're entirely too reserved, thinking that we don't want to upset our really private lives, truthfully. We like our mediocre, half-dim lives because we'd rather sort of a lukewarm okayness than a radical newness of fecund life, you know, because we're not sure what that might mean for us. You know, what would a world of justice and peace look like? I mean, you know, a world of bitcoins and, you know, alternative economies and, you know, new forms that we're harvesting together. With Martians and, you know, Kepler. You know, I mean, we're afraid.
Give me my Starbucks. What will happen to my Starbucks in that universe?
Exactly. Right.
I think you're spot on. This would cost me something. What do you mean?
Absolutely.
I have to change?
Yeah, that's right. So we want kind of a cosmetic change. We want to look good, but we don't want really any substantial change. You know, or when we come back to the language of substance, we don't want any kind of real interior change where, you know, my whole awareness is going to change. I'm going to change. Oh, my God. And people always like, oh, my God, that is just too much for me, you know, because we don't have a sense of future. I really don't think you have a sense. We have no sense that something's up ahead. But that is actually the core of Christianity. It's all about future. It's all about newness and new creation. So, you know, it does make me a little bit suspect of about, you know, 2 billion Catholics in the world. But I think, you know, I think I have to begin with my own self rather than looking out, you know, at everyone else. And that's, it is to keep working. You know, we have to, St. Paul says this, we have to keep plowing the field. You know, it's a lot of work. I mean, really, I think a deepened, committed life, whether it's to Christianity or Judaism or Islam or just to Zen Buddhism, it's a lot of committed work is commitment, right? And you have to do it. You have to put your hand to the plow and not look back, going, oh, you know, it was so much easier then, and this is so much work. And I think we have to say, well, what is it that we're working toward? Is there anything larger than ourselves? Do we really have any vision? So we do need vision. We need what would the world look like, you know, in a whole different matrix, maybe even a geographical matrix, since global warming will eventually, you know, open up the Arctic Pole, the North Pole, the channels will be opened. I'm sure Florida will peel off. California will eventually patch. We can begin to see mergers of continents. I think there's, I was reading about this not too long ago. That I think it was Africa and something else. You know, the continents are shifting. You know, the planes are shifting. So for us to think that this is all going to stay the same, you know, we're going to go to heaven and sit with God, it's just the most outrageous illusion that we could possibly have. So we are really, we're killing ourselves, and we're killing the earth with it. You know, we have, you know, I guess Deuteronomy says, I set before you life and death. You know, what do you want? I don't think it's a matter of God. It's not a question of God or not God. It's just like, what do we want?
Well, and this brings us full circle in a really great way to where we started about if we can perceive consciousness as this matrix that's holding all things together, well then, my God, what's holding me back from risking and leaping forward into the unknown, knowing as we do, if consciousness is this net holding all things together, we will be caught by love. Our creativity will be met, and our efforts and our sacrifices to trust, to do that leap fall into the future, will be responded to. And that invitation feels to me like that's what I feel like I'm going to take away from this conversation, is just how can I continue to risk in the dangerous spaces of the unknown, with that full capacity to trust that there can be a new way forward, and I want to participate in that. Yeah.
Right. Wonderful. Yeah. Well said, Bree. And, maybe we could just end on the women mystics who really did trust, and they really honed their mind, their conscious mind, toward love. Mm-hmm. And amazing. I mean, in the face of oppression, the role of the status of women as, earth and political pawns, and, what they were able to accomplish in their own lives and what they bequeathed to us, that really we have the capacity to do amazingly new things. But I think we maybe need to look to the women mystics, as a beginning too. How do you move beyond the confines of what seems like very circumscribed situations where you're oppressed? Mm-hmm. How do you find a new freedom in oppression? Mm-hmm. And it is possible, and it begins within, right? As they did, through radical discipline, prayer, and commitment, and trust, and surrender.
Awesome.
To love. Yeah.
Awesome.
All right.
Thank you, Ilia. This was so enriching.
Yeah, it's good. Yeah, thank you.